Okay, so even though this case comes with 3 white fans already, because we're using the Corsair Hydro H100i, we want to use those white fans, but we're going to leave the 2 that are here on this side so we can actually have a push-pull on the radiator, and we'll talk more about that later. But we're going to put the radiator on top of this and then put the 2 Corsair fans on top of that. We are going to remove this 1 white fan in the back because we have 3 fans in our Corsair fan kit, and we're going to put a Corsair fan here instead. So let's go ahead and remove this one real quick. Okay, next thing we're going to do in preparation for the motherboard placement is we're going to check all the standoff screws. Now, they are already in here, but if you have a tool for this, you can actually check to make sure they're tight. The reason why this is important is if they're loose, and you go ahead and tighten your motherboard screws down, when you go to unscrew your motherboard, you might actually unscrew it from the standoff screw into the case, and that'll come off where the bolt is in the motherboard with the standoff screw. So just make sure they're all tight. It's just a good practice to do. It's not mandatory, but it makes it a lot easier if you're going to be changing out parts in the future. I've had cases come in that have had the standoff screws already stripped out, so it's always good to check. While we're on that subject, this is already preset for a ATX case. If you're going to be doing a mini ITX case, you're only going to use these 4 standoffs right here. If you're doing a micro ATX case, you're going to use those 4 plus 1 here and 1 here, or 1 here depending on which motherboard you have. And there's also a motherboard screw placement right here for the ATX. But these 9 screws where they are currently is what is designed for an ATX case. So let's get ready to put that in. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and put the motherboard in our case now. A few things of caution on this. On this particular motherboard, the I/O shield comes pre-built onto the motherboard, so you don't have to worry about putting that in there first. Which is great, but if you happen to have one that this piece is separate, you'll want to make sure that this piece goes in there prior to actually putting the motherboard in. If you get the motherboard in there without that shield in, and you get all that finished with your build, that piece is just not missing, it's not in there anymore, and it just looks a little less professional. So this one's built in though, we're all just going to just slide it in. And I'm going to go ahead and take these pieces of protective film off, because once we go past this point, they'll be a little harder to get off. Make sure everything lines up as nice and snug, and you can grab your 8 screws and start screwing the motherboard in. One quick word of caution. Not all the case manufacturers have this nice large hole in the back. So when you're using a certain backplate for a certain cooler, it might actually require you to put a backplate on. In this circumstance, I knew that we had a nice big opening for us to use, but some cases don't have a big opening or have an opening at all. You'll want to make sure that you put your backplate on prior to putting your motherboard in your case. And that's what we're going to use for the CPU cooler. We're going to go ahead and remove the dust shield. We can put this back on later, but for right now, when we do the radiator on the other side of these fans, we're going to need to remove these screws. Now we can leave some in there for right now. When we put the radiator on the back side, we're going to have to put a couple through on each side to be able to reach through to the radiator, hold the radiator onto the case. Also, one point of note on this case, the Snowblind case, oddly enough, that the lights for the LEDs for the screen in the front still use a 4-pin Molex, which is surprising. I would think that by now we'd probably be using the SATA power, but this one still uses a 4-pin Molex. Let's talk about the way we want to have our airflow in this case. There's no airflow coming in from the front. The only airflow is coming in from here, so we're going to make these in the intakes, and this rear fan is going to be the exhaust. So these both push-pull on the radiator, but bringing it in as an intake, and this is going to be our exhaust. Okay, so the fun part about push-pull is when the radiator is in between the case and the fan, you have to be able to fit this through the case and then catch it through the fan and then have it go through into the radiator. So that's always the fun part. You also don't want to tighten them all down until you get the bottom fan in. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and put our back plate on for the CPU cooler. There is an adhesive piece on here you can actually take off. And then we're going to mount it to the back. These bolts are adjustable, so you can adjust them as you need it to fit. And it should adhere a little bit on there. It might not stay on there super tight, but the point is to get it to hold on there long enough for the CPU cooler on the front. So we'll press it down, make sure it stays a little bit on there. That should be good. Now we can lay it down. Be careful with this. These are sharp edges. You don't want this like rolling along your case and make it into where it's going to scratch something or damage the fins on the radiator. We're going to mount these screws in. And a good finger tight should be enough. You don't have to get them on there really hard. Next thing we're going to do is clean off our CPU and get ready for this thermal paste that's on here. Now we're going to go ahead and just leave the stock thermal paste so we can get some baseline temperatures of how it works with the stock thermal paste. We might pull this off later on and replace the thermal paste with some like Thermal Grizzly or some Arctic Silver 5. But for right now we're just going to use the paste that comes with it so we can get some baseline levels for the Corsair cooler itself. Alright, so what you want to do is use an alcohol pad or alcohol and make sure you get off the CPU clean. With the CPU, between that and the thermal paste on the CPU cooler, even things like fingerprint grease or fingerprint dust can cause as not a good connection. And then right before you want to put the CPU cooler on, we want to go ahead and let it dry off, as well as give it one little final polish. And pull this off. And we want the Corsair up on this one specifically. We want to just get it in place as best we can for right now. Once you have it down on there, just briefly hold it in place like this while you get some of your screws started. Make sure your thermal paste is getting some good connection with the CPU. And once they're all slightly snug, you can tighten up a little bit more, but this doesn't need to be much more than finger tight. You just want good contact more than heavy tightness. Try to tighten evenly, and you'll feel them bottom out, and that should be about it. Now we can run our cables a little better. We can keep this up to the top. Since there's no fans up here, we can probably just go ahead and keep this out of the way, so that way it's not hitting and take up the view of the RAM. We'll probably keep it up like this. At this point, you can plug in 2 of the fans to this little link here. We're going to plug in all of the fans directly to the Corsair Node Pro. This little guy needs to go to your CPU header, and then all these cords can be brought back through the back. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and get the cable extension started. Alright, so we've taken our Asian horse extension cables and we kind of sort of pre-molded them a little bit so they'll be the shape that we need. Now we're going to start off with the 8-pin for the CPU power, and we're going to put that in first. Next we're going to put in the 24-pin extension. So sometimes aesthetics has to give way to performance, and in this case, although it looks better for the fans to be in the front like this, we don't want air to push through this direction, we want air to come through this direction. So the fans will be backwards, but the RGBs should still be pretty bright on them, so we should see it pretty good. But in this case, we're going to let performance override aesthetics. So for this build, we're going to be using an 8-via 1050 watt power supply. It's semi-modular. The 24-pin, of course, is just going to go to the extension. The CPU power is going to go to the CPU power. And then we went ahead and plugged in both the Molex and the SATA powers because we're going to use both. And we just didn't want to have to worry about where the cord's going to be. So we're going to use all of these. This fan is usually an intake, so what we're going to actually do is install this upside down. The RGB will shine a little bit of light down below the computer, and then it'll allow this for it to pull air in through the bottom, through what was going to be a little dust cover, and then exhaust out the back. So this is the way we're going to install it. Alright, so we're getting ready to install this vertical GPU bracket. The first thing we want to do is take the PCIe Express riser card and we're going to mount it to the bracket. You want to get these pretty snug without actually snapping any of the board because this is going to be supporting the entire weight of your GPU. The next thing we're going to do is figure out how many spaces we need, if we want just one or two or three, or we got to stack these up on top of each other. So we're going to install this in and get a good feel of how much we want space-wise. So this bracket goes in like this. So then we can kind of sort of take our spacers and just kind of sort of see what fits. We want to keep this flat and level. We don't want to have it hanging down like it is right now. There's not a lot of support here, so I might end up usually using two of the thick ones, or all three, but we'll see how it goes. And this might move a little bit over time. So I think that those two brackets those two spacers are probably going to be enough, and that'll keep us nice and level. So now we can go ahead and take it out. One word of caution before putting in the GPU and the GPU bracket is that everything's behind this, so you need to make sure that everything's already plugged in. You don't want to put this all in there and then realize you have something unplugged and not be able to get to it, and then you'll have to pull this all back out. Alright, now we're ready to go ahead and install our vertical GPU bracket. Now we can install our PCI riser Express card into the top slot. Make sure it snaps in there and is in there snug. We want to make sure these are back just a little bit. Keep them out of the way for the GPU. And now we can install our GPU. And that right there is why we put in vertical GPU brackets.